She was holding a teacup, not a weapon. But the officer standing on her porch pointed his finger at her like she was already guilty. He had no idea he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. By the end of this story, a quiet Sunday afternoon would turn into a lesson that an entire neighborhood would never forget. Stay with me, because this is what happens when the law meets a woman who is the law. Meadow Ridge was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were always trimmed and the mailboxes matched. Brick homes lined the street in neat rows, shaded by tall oak trees that had stood there for decades. Every driveway had 2 cars. Every porch had a wreath on the door. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and most of the people who lived there liked it exactly that way. Renee Ashford had worked for this. She had grown up in a small apartment 2 hours away, the daughter of a nurse and a bus driver, and she had studied harder than anyone she knew to make it through law school. She had spent years in courtrooms, standing across from defense attorneys who underestimated her, and years more building a reputation as one of the sharpest federal prosecutors in the state. When she finally signed the papers on the brick colonial at 218 Cedar Lane, it felt like proof that all those long nights had meant something. She had lived there for exactly 1 month. She had spent her first few weekends in the house slowly making it her own, hanging photographs in the hallway, arranging books on the shelves in the study, learning which floorboards creaked near the kitchen and which window caught the best morning light. It was the first house she had ever owned outright, bought with her own money, after her own years of work, and every small task of settling in still felt like a quiet celebration. On this particular Sunday afternoon, Renee had the whole day to herself for the first time in weeks. No case files spread across the table. No phone calls from her office. Just quiet. She brewed a pot of tea, poured it into a delicate glass teacup, and carried it out to the front porch to enjoy the afternoon sun. She wore a fitted navy dress, the kind she usually saved for the courtroom, simply because it made her feel put together, even on a day off. Her hair was pulled into a neat braided updo. She looked calm. She looked composed. She looked, in every possible way, like a woman standing in the home she had earned. None of the neighbors on Cedar Lane knew any of that yet. All they saw was a black woman they did not recognize, standing on the porch of a house that used to belong to somebody else. 2 doors down, a woman named Denise Pruitt sat by her front window, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Denise had lived on Cedar Lane for nearly 15 years, longer than almost anyone else on the block. She considered herself the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood. She knew every car that belonged there. She knew every delivery schedule. She had strong opinions about the height of everyone's hedges. What Denise did not know was that the Miller family, who used to live at 218 Cedar Lane, had sold their house a month earlier. She had missed the post about it in the neighborhood group, buried somewhere between a complaint about a barking dog and a reminder about trash pickup. As far as Denise was concerned, the Miller house still belonged to the Millers, and the woman standing on that porch, drinking tea like she owned the place, did not belong there at all. Denise did not walk over to introduce herself. She did not knock on the door and ask a simple question. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed for help, her voice already shifting into the breathless, urgent tone she used whenever she wanted to be taken seriously. "Yes, I need someone to come to 218 Cedar Lane right away," she said. "There is a woman on the porch who does not belong there. She is just standing there like she owns the place, and I do not recognize her at all. I think she might be trying to break in." The dispatcher asked a few more questions. Denise answered each one with growing certainty, turning her assumption into something that sounded, by the end of the call, almost like a fact. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser turned onto Cedar Lane. It rolled slowly down the street before coming to a stop directly in front of Renee's home, its lights flashing silently against the brick. Officer Wade Kessler stepped out of the cruiser first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the kind of stiff confidence that came from years of being obeyed without question. Behind him came his partner, a younger officer named Tyler Combs, who glanced nervously up and down the quiet street as if bracing for something far more dangerous than what they had actually been called about. Renee stood on her porch, teacup and saucer still in her hands, watching the officers approach. She did not move. She did not set her tea down in alarm. She simply waited, the way she had waited through countless tense moments in a courtroom, letting silence do some of the work before she spoke a single word. Step forward and show me some identification, Kessler said, his tone sharp and already demanding, as though the conversation had begun somewhere in the middle rather than at the start. May I ask what this is regarding? Renee replied, her voice calm and even. We received a call about a possible break-in at this address. Kessler raised his hand and pointed his finger directly at her chest, the way a person points at someone they have already decided is guilty. I need proof that you actually live here, and I need it right now. Renee looked down at the finger pointed toward her, then slowly back up at his face. This is my home, she said simply. I closed on this property 1 month ago. I have lived here every single day since. That is what everyone says in this situation, Kessler snapped. I am not going to believe that without seeing some form of identification. I do not have a legal obligation to prove where I live based on a phone call from a neighbor who simply did not recognize my face, Renee said. You have not shown me a warrant. You have not given me a single reason to believe a crime has taken place here. All you have is one person's assumption, and you are treating that assumption as though it were evidence. Kessler's jaw tightened. He was not used to being challenged, and certainly not with such calm, measured words from someone he had already decided did not belong in a house like this one. Do not make this more difficult than it has to be. I am giving you one more opportunity to cooperate before this becomes a real problem. I am cooperating completely, Renee said. I am standing on my own porch, in my own home, holding a cup of tea that has almost certainly gone cold by now. What I am not going to do is hand over my private information simply because you have decided, without any actual proof, that I look like I do not belong here. Officer Combs shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing between his partner and the woman standing so still on the porch. Something about the way she spoke made him uneasy, though he could not quite put a finger on why. She did not sound frightened. She did not sound defensive. She sounded like someone who already knew exactly how this conversation was going to end. Kessler stepped closer, his patience clearly running out. This is your last warning. Show me identification right now, or we are going to have a much bigger problem than a simple conversation on your porch. Renee set her teacup down gently on the porch railing, taking her time, refusing to let his tone rush her. Her eyes locked onto his, steady and completely unafraid. Officer Kessler, she said, reading the name plate pinned to his chest. Before you decide what that bigger problem is going to look like, I strongly suggest you radio your supervisor. Tell him exactly where you are standing right now, and tell him who you are speaking to. I am not calling anyone over a simple trespassing complaint. I am not a trespasser. Her voice dropped lower, firmer, carrying the same weight she used when addressing a courtroom. I am a federal prosecutor for this district, and within the next few minutes, you are going to wish you had made that call before raising your voice at me, instead of after. For a moment, the entire street went completely silent. Even the birds seemed to pause. Officer Combs slowly lowered the hand that had been resting near his belt. Kessler's confident expression cracked, just slightly, replaced by something closer to genuine doubt. You are going to have to prove that, he said, though the force had already drained out of his voice. That will not be difficult at all, Renee replied evenly. Call your captain. Ask for Captain Ellis Barrow. Tell him you are standing outside the home of Renee Ashford. I promise you, he will recognize that name immediately. Combs did not wait to be told twice. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. We need a supervisor at 218 Cedar Lane immediately. It is urgent. The dispatcher's reply crackled back a moment later. Copy that. Unit 14. Captain Barrow is already en route. Estimated arrival, 5 minutes. Those 5 minutes felt far longer than any 5 minutes had ever felt before, at least for Officer Kessler. Renee did not go back inside her house. She picked her teacup back up, walked calmly to the wicker chair at the edge of her porch, and sat down, sipping slowly while Kessler shifted his weight from foot to foot in her driveway, unsure of exactly where to look. Word travels quickly on a quiet street. One by one, neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the flashing lights and the unfamiliar tension hanging in the air. Denise Pruitt stood at the edge of her own lawn, arms crossed over her cardigan, watching with an expression of quiet satisfaction, certain that the moment of vindication she had been waiting for was only minutes away. Renee said nothing to any of them. She did not scroll through her phone. She did not pace or fidget the way a person with something to hide might. She simply sat, calm and composed, her eyes drifting occasionally toward the street, waiting for the next chapter of this story to arrive. When Captain Ellis Barrow's car finally turned onto Cedar Lane, it did not park neatly along the curb the way a routine visit might. He pulled up quickly, climbed out before the engine had fully settled, and removed his hat as he crossed the lawn, his posture completely different from Kessler's stiff, assertive walk. "Ms. Ashford," he said, his voice carrying real respect, "I am very sorry for what has happened here today." Officer Kessler stepped back immediately. Kessler opened his mouth as if to offer an explanation, then thought better of it and said nothing at all. "Captain," Renee said, rising slowly from her chair, "your officer pointed his finger at me and threatened me on my own porch because a neighbor did not recognize my face. Before we go any further, I want the original emergency call pulled and sent to your phone right now." "It is already on its way to me," Barrow said grimly, glancing down as the audio file arrived. He played it aloud, right there on the porch, and Denise Pruitt's breathless voice rang out clearly across the quiet street for every neighbor gathered to hear. Renee listened without a single change in her expression. When the recording finally ended, she looked past the captain, down the sidewalk, toward the woman still standing at the edge of her own driveway. "Captain," Renee said quietly, "walk with me." Denise's confident smile faded the instant Renee reached the end of her driveway. She had expected to watch the officers lead a stranger away in handcuffs. Instead, she found herself facing a woman whose calm, steady gaze made her stomach twist with sudden, unfamiliar doubt. "I am so glad they got here so quickly," Denise said, already rehearsing the version of the story she planned to tell later. "I just did not recognize you, and you truly can never be too careful these days." "Mrs. Pruitt," Captain Barrow said, cutting her off before she could continue, "I need you to stop talking and listen very carefully." Renee stepped closer, and for the first time, Denise seemed to actually see the woman standing in front of her, not simply a stranger glimpsed through a window, but a real person with a name, a career, and a life that Denise had put at risk with a single phone call. "My name is Renee Ashford," she said. "I am the legal owner of 218 Cedar Lane, and I am a federal prosecutor for this district. You called for emergency assistance on a woman making tea in her own home, simply because you did not recognize her face." Denise's cheeks turned pale. "I did not know who you were. I promise, I was only trying to be careful." Being careful would have meant checking the neighborhood page, where the sale of this house was posted weeks ago, Renee said. Being careful would have meant walking over and introducing yourself, the way any reasonable neighbor might. Instead, you assumed the worst, and you sent armed officers to my home based on nothing more than a guess about who I must be. If Officer Kessler had been a little less patient today, this afternoon could have ended very differently, and not just for me. I am so sorry. I really did not mean any harm by it. Calling for emergency help on someone simply because they do not match the picture you had in your head is not a small mistake, Mrs. Pruitt. It has real consequences, for me, and now, for you as well. Renee turned toward the captain. I want a detective to take her formal statement this afternoon. Understood, Barrow replied, already reaching for his radio. Renee turned back toward Officer Kessler, who still had not moved from the end of the driveway, his earlier confidence entirely gone. Officer, you did not investigate today. You assumed, and then you pointed your finger at an innocent woman standing in her own doorway, on her own property. When you sit down with your supervisors this week, I hope you think very carefully about the kind of officer you actually want to be. She did not wait for a reply. There was nothing left for him to say that would change what had already happened. News of what happened on Cedar Lane spread quickly, the way news always does in a small, tight neighborhood. By that evening, the story had already worked its way through half the block, each retelling adding a small detail, until barely anyone remembered exactly how it had actually unfolded. Captain Barrow, however, remembered every detail precisely, because he was the one who had to write the official report. Officer Kessler was placed on administrative leave that same week, pending a full internal review of his conduct. Officer Combs, to his credit, gave a full and honest statement, describing exactly what he had seen and heard, including the moment his partner raised his voice and pointed his finger at a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. Denise Pruitt received a visit from a detective 2 days later, just as Renee had promised. She sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had once confidently dialed for help, and gave a statement of her own, this time far less certain of herself than she had been on that Sunday afternoon. A few weeks later, the neighborhood held its regular community meeting, the same meeting Denise had run for years with quiet authority. This time, she sat near the back, saying very little. Captain Barrow attended as well, standing at the front of the room to explain, in careful and measured words, exactly what steps the department was taking to make sure nothing like this would happen again on Cedar Lane, or anywhere else in the city. Renee did not attend. She did not need to. Her presence had already changed something in that neighborhood, quietly and permanently, the moment she refused to hand over her identification simply because someone had decided she looked out of place. Some neighbors later admitted, quietly and privately, that the meeting had made them think harder about their own habits, the small assumptions they made every day without ever noticing them. It was not a dramatic transformation. Cedar Lane did not suddenly become a different place overnight. But little by little, people began greeting new faces on the street with a wave instead of a suspicious glance, and that small shift, however slow, mattered more than any of them said out loud. A month after that Sunday afternoon, Cedar Lane looked exactly the same as it always had. The lawns were still trimmed. The mailboxes still matched. But something underneath the surface of the neighborhood had shifted, quietly, in a way most people could feel even if they could not fully explain it. Officer Kessler did not return to patrol duty. After the internal review concluded, he was offered a desk assignment instead, a decision that effectively ended the career he had spent 15 years building on the street. He never contacted Renee, and she never expected him to. Some lessons are not meant to come with an apology attached. Officer Combs, on the other hand, requested a transfer to a training division a few months later. He told his supervisors he wanted to teach new recruits how to slow down, ask better questions, and lead with facts instead of assumptions. He mentioned, more than once, that the afternoon on Cedar Lane was the reason he had changed his mind about the kind of officer he wanted to become. Denise Pruitt eventually reached a quiet agreement with the district attorney's office, one that required her to complete a community education course and issue a formal written apology, which was read aloud, at Renee's request, during the following neighborhood meeting. Denise did not run the meetings anymore. She still lived on Cedar Lane, but she kept her blinds open now, and she made a point of introducing herself to every new face on the block before assuming anything at all. As for Renee, she kept living her life exactly the way she always had, one careful, deliberate step at a time. She still drank her tea on the porch on quiet Sunday afternoons. She still wore her navy dress when the mood struck her, whether or not she had anywhere important to be. The only difference now was that everyone on Cedar Lane knew exactly who she was, and more importantly, they understood that her right to sit peacefully on her own porch had never once depended on their permission. Renee Ashford never raised her voice that afternoon. She never lost her composure, and she never once reached for anything but the truth. All she had was her calm certainty, and the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was, no matter what assumptions a stranger might make about her from behind a curtain. This story is a reminder that respect should never depend on how someone looks, what they are wearing, or whether a neighbor happens to recognize their face. It is a reminder that knowing your rights, and standing calmly in them, can change the entire outcome of a single afternoon. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful, true-to-life stories about justice, respect, and standing up for yourself when it matters most.